Now, and a federal agency, the EPA, is imposing a rule that by itself will cost almost as much as an entire stimulus package.
Wow.
$760 billion. I'm talking close to $1 trillion.
My name is Mike Maucelii, and this is the Energy Show with REI Energy, where we're energizing your investments and maximizing your tax deductions. Today, we're going to be talking about carbon tax, and you're going to discover how the Biden government is pursuing a tax on every aspect of your life and what it will take to stop it. My guest today is Daren Bakst. Daren is the director of the Competitive Enterprise Institute Center for Energy and Environment. Great to have you back on the show today, Daren.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So anyway, there's, of course, as you know, and I guess everyone in the country's heard that, now the administration is wanting to tax us on carbon. And I wanted to kind of get your opinion. Well, first off, I'd like to know what is a carbon tax and how is that going to affect regular people?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a secret that a lot of people especially on the left, would like to impose a carbon tax, which is simply a tax on. There's a lot of different ways to create it. Any type of carbon emissions, figure out a way to tax it so that it discourages the use of carbon, the emission, any type of production of carbon, primarily going after fossil fuels. That's the main purpose.
You mean if someone goes out and resurfaces their driveway with asphalt, that they're going to be taxed for it?
Well, I don't know. It depends on how it would be set up, but it very well could mean that. We don't know. There is a piece of legislation that's been introduced in the Senate called the Prove It Act, and we're concerned that it might be introduced in the House as well. The legislation would create it would set in motion the process that would lead to the carbon tax. It basically would have the Department of Energy measure the carbon intensity of domestic goods, not just foreign goods, but domestic goods. And what it does by doing that, it addresses an obstacle that carbon tax proponents have in terms of creating a carbon tax, which is some type of scheme to measure the carbon intensity of different goods. So this bill lays the foundation for what would become a carbon tax.
And is that in front of the Congress now or is it in front of the
Yeah.
Senate?
The Senate is it actually was favorably approved or voted out of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee several months ago. And there are a few Republicans actually supporting the bill, which is concerning. Don't know that
Yeah.
it's going to go anywhere in the Senate. We certainly hope not. But what we are also concerned with right now is that there might be a House companion bill introduced, and we don't know if it will be, it likely will be. And then we want to make sure that that doesn't go anywhere. So if we think it's a terrible idea, well, carbon taxes are a terrible idea in general. A carbon tax, when you think about the fact that 80% of our energy production is connected to fossil fuels, is derived from fossil fuels, it basically means pretty much everything, every aspect of our lives would somehow get taxed in some way. And if you think about it, even any industry, any sector of the economy relies on fossil fuels, including the renewable energy industry relies on fossil fuels. So when you think about a carbon tax, it's really a tax on life. It's a tax
Yeah.
on American life.
Well, you've seen over the last week where, people in Europe now are pushing back on all these ludicrous carbon taxes and, I guess they're trying to move to the right and people are finally waking up and you've got farmers that are, in France that are obviously protesting about it. And so what can we learn here in the United States from what they've gone through?
Yeah, well, hopefully we will learn from what they're going through. Uh, we are doing a lot of the things that they're done and they're trying to do, which is pushing kind of this Green New Deal type of policies, which is everything from trying to restrict farmers from being able to farm the way they want to be able to produce their food, uh, from driving up energy prices and punishing fossil fuels and shutting down reliable electricity sources. And then a lot of the European countries kind of having to go back on what their initial goals were on like shutting down certain energy sources because they realize you have to have fossil fuels. So it's good to see that the Europeans are pushing back. They see the problem. They look, people want to have affordable electricity and energy. They don't want to not have it. They don't want the government telling them how to live, where to live, what to drive. And you're seeing the pushback in Europe. We're starting to see some of these policies here in the US, certainly. And, if the Biden administration got its way, we probably would continue to follow the lead of Europe. And we shouldn't be following EU's lead. We should be rejecting it and instead pushing policies that like unleash American energy and allow Americans to kind of have freedom and choose how they want to live their lives, not being told what kind of cars to drive, etc. All the different things that we're seeing here in the US. So hopefully the lessons will be learned. I don't have a lot of faith that it will be, but I'm hoping.
Biden, he's one of the only presidents that, I think he may be the only president that's going to run on a campaign of raising people's taxes. I don't know how well that's going to go over, but but if he was to get reelected, I mean, how might a carbon tax aid Biden in the Green New Deal?
Well, I think it would certainly aid it. I do. I mean, I think John Podesta, who's kind of I guess now the climate czar for the Biden administration, has said that what's called a carbon border adjustment mechanism would be, or suggested that it would be part of the second term. So I would expect some type of carbon tax effort of some kind. Now that might simply be limited to carbon taxes on imports, but it might be broader. I certainly think they would like to push for a domestic carbon tax and a kind of a carbon tax on imports or / carbon tariffs, whatever you want to call it. But what would happen if they win is we'll continue to see. First of all, they're going to defend their already problematic regulations we've already seen this term. So their rule that would have the EPA effectively dictate the electricity mix in this country, their new power plant rule, they'll defend that. So that would be more difficult to get rid of. Their rule, the vehicle tailpipe rule, that will limit how much gas-powered vehicles are available in the future, they'll defend that. So it'll be more difficult to get rid of that. If there was a change, it would be in the administration, in the White House, then there's likelihood that some of those very harmful policies, it'll be easier to get rid of those policies. Let's put it that way.
Well, let's hope everybody gets out and votes because we sure don't need to go down this road. We've got enough taxes here in the United States now without continuing to add more.
Yeah, I mean, I should point out that the vehicle tailpipe rule, the car rule, the cost of that rule, the total cost is $760 billion. The rule itself, put that in context. The Obama stimulus bill in I think 2009 was projected to cost $787 billion. At the time, people thought that was insane. It was crazy. How could Congress spend so much money? Now, and a federal agency, the EPA, is imposing a rule that by itself will cost almost as much as an entire stimulus package. $760 billion. I'm talking close to $1 trillion. I can tell you that that estimate of $760 billion is low because it doesn't take into account a lot of factors, a lot of other issues. So to have an agency, unelected officials, imposing that kind of cost on Americans is disturbing. And it goes to show some of the problems we have with separation of powers and Congress not making the decisions. They should be making those choices, not an agency. Agency just going crazy and just interpreting the law to achieve their objectives and working backwards because they figure out a way to justify what they're doing and manipulating the law to try to get to what they're trying to do, which is basically put people out of gas-powered vehicles.
This agency, they're non-elected people?
Well, the EPA itself, any federal agency is technically not elected. Somebody could argue that the Well, the president is elected, therefore anybody in the officials in the other agencies that he oversees, therefore there's some type of accountability in that sense. But that's a bit extreme to kind of claim that. The agencies are doing all kinds of things the president has little knowledge about, and if he does, certainly has that influence. But to have, even if that was true, to even have one person kind of being kind of this overseer of policy and ignoring Congress, which is the one that has the lawmaking power, is a problem. Congress has the lawmaking power. It needs to actually develop the laws, make the laws, and the administration, the executive branch, should implement and faithfully execute the laws.
As far as the government, I mean, if something like this was to pass, I mean, do they have some kind of guidelines on how they're going to measure carbon to tax citizens and businesses?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the big challenges for trying to develop a carbon tax. It is in the Prove It Act. That's one of the things I was talking about. The Prove It Act is trying to give the DOE, Department of Energy, authority to kind of create some type of really complicated system to figure out how to measure all of this and measure carbon intensity of goods, and whether or not it's even feasible or even possible is questionable, honestly. And what they'll do is the Department of Energy under this bill has the ability to kind of add different industries as they go along to keep measuring their carbon intensity. So as a practical matter, it may not even be feasible, and it'll be prone to all kinds of special interests, all kinds of lobbying to try to manipulate the system so it's favorable to one industry or have an industry excluded, another industry included. So it's really a disaster. It will drive up prices for Americans. It will, if you have a carbon tax, in this case, what's called a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is what the EU is pushing. So they've created this new thing called a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is what some legislators really want, which is both a carbon tax and import. So people call that carbon tariffs, but it's a tax and imports. So that would drive up costs for businesses and also consumers, and then a domestic carbon tax.
Jesus. So does the Prove Act, I get Prove It Act is the name of it, does it target domestic or international goods?
Both. I mean, what it does is it is a measure. So the proponents will make this red herring argument like, well, the bill doesn't authorize the carbon tax. Well, we know the bill itself doesn't authorize the carbon tax. What it does is it creates the information necessary to create the carbon tax. We know, we've seen this movie before. In the Inflation Reduction Act, Congress used information from EPA's greenhouse gas reporting program, and they created the first federal methane tax using that information. So Republicans didn't vote, not one Republican voted for the Inflation Reduction Act. It was solely the Democrats voting for it. And there was nothing Republicans could do. Once that information was available, it made it possible to create the first methane tax. That was just a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. That is exactly what's going to happen with the Prove It Act. You're going to have all this different information, and then Congress likely will use some type of reconciliation process. So not having to figure out a way to get around the filibuster and shove through legislation that will create the carbon tax using the information collected under the Prove It Act. That's exactly what we expect will happen. And that's why over 40 organizations recently sent a letter to House members adamantly opposing the Prove It Act, because we do think it's a serious threat to the economy and the well-being of American families.
Because isn't that going to cause companies to want to leave the U.S.? I mean, obviously, if they got to pay these carbon taxes, and of course, that's going to create less jobs. And, the whole idea behind, America was to manufacture here in the U.S., but it sounds to me like, the government's doing its best to push people away.
It gets complicated in the sense that some bigger companies, they may not feel as much that way. I mean, look, the EU is already pushing these policies. So sometimes the bigger companies might see the value in like a regulatory harmonization between the countries. But for smaller businesses, yeah, I think they should be very concerned about it. So, I mean, the proponents, what they do, a lot of the proponents, there's no coincidence that the biggest proponents of this bill are the biggest carbon tax proponents. But there are some legislators that will claim that, oh, what we're trying to do through the Prove It Act is to show that we're more environmentally friendly than other countries. And that's really the purpose. Well, respectively, even if that was true, which I honestly, I don't want to get into their intent, but so they point to China, and they know that bringing up China is like a great way to try to get support for their bill, which is just a carbon tax, a bill to create a carbon tax. So let's throw in China as an argument for it. That's what I think what's going on. But if you wanted to try to show that China is less uh, friendly when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, or try to address the disparity that exists, then there's a lot simpler ways of doing so than having to devastate the United States economy in the meantime. And one way to address that issue about China emissions is in environmental treaties, China is still considered a developing country. So China, which is the largest exporter in the world and the second largest economy in the world, is, to clarify, to stress, considered a developing country under these environmental treaties, and therefore don't have the same obligation that the United States does. So if we really want to treat some type of the issue of disparity between China and the US, there's a very direct, simple way to do so. Just stop treating China as a developing country, because they're not. So that's a simple solution, and it doesn't make American families suffer in the meantime.
I agree with you 100%. I mean, obviously, I think all this green push is to just promote China because they've cornered the market on all the lithium and all of the stuff that it takes to build electric cars and windmills and solar panels. And, they're trying to impose that on us where, China and India both, I think they decided not to go into the Paris Climate Accord. And so that ought to tell you something about what their feelings are.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about a lot of the policies that are being pushed, we are right now the Biden administration is trying to push us into less reliable source of energy, get us, and at the same time, in terms of electricity, at the same time trying to increase demand for electricity by putting us into EVs. So none of that makes sense. It plays into the hands of countries like China, which what you just pointed out, and doesn't kind of play into our own strengths, that at least our current strengths right now. So we have a reliable grid. We have good electricity sources, natural gas, coal, nuclear, but we're shooting ourselves in the foot. And at some point, as electricity prices go up and we start getting blackouts and people get fed up with being told that they can't use natural gas stoves or they can't drive gas-powered vehicles, people will start pushing back. I think you're already seeing that, and hopefully we'll really push back because we don't want to go down this road. The energy is too important to make it unreliable and unaffordable.
Yeah, and it's like you said, I mean, a lot of the bigger corporations may be okay with it because obviously their goal is to, put the little man guy out of business, right? And when you have these taxes, I mean, it doesn't affect the rich. I mean, it affects the poor because everything gets pushed down to the consumer. So if we have to change the way we live, I mean, the middle class are the ones that are going to suffer the most.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges with some of these issues is trying to make sure that, you have the Inflation Reduction Act, which gives all kinds of subsidies to big businesses. And one of the big challenges for the good guys here is to try to dismantle the green subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act. The money is being spent is to try to force electrification in the United States. And one concern that we will have is that certain businesses will, because they're getting the subsidies, may be less resistant to try to fight back. So they're not necessarily all going to be allies, big businesses, as it relates to pushing back against the IRA. So pushing back against the IRA is critical for us. Pushing back against the Prove It Act and any effort to impose carbon taxes is critical. And just any policy, be it regulations, because regulatory front is really the big issue. Any policies to try to centrally plan the way energy is produced, and especially to do so in a way that actually hurts Americans, is something that we should reject.
So how do you explain, the Senate, I mean, led by Chuck Schumer, he just formally came out and asked the DOJ to prosecute oil executives for fixing gas prices.
Well, I don't know what Chuck's thinking, but I will say that it's convenient. Look, anytime there's high gas prices, Democrats usually, or just liberals generally, usually want to blame price gouging, the oil companies, blah, 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 instead of their own policies that they know intentionally actually drive up the prices. So they don't ever want to actually look at themselves. They actually just want to blame others. So
They want to
that's
blame
usual, it's
Republicans,
typical.
right?
Yeah, I mean it's typical. We know the script, and it's important to kind of know that when gas prices come out, just wait for the price gouging arguments and how oil companies are just trying to make all kinds of money. So it's the usual.
Yeah. So what can our listeners do to fight back against the Prove It Act?
Well, just as with anything, just let your members of Congress know what your views are on the Prove It Act. It's important. Right now, we're concerned, like I said, about the House, potentially somebody in the House introducing the bill. So that's really kind of the focus right now. Just making sure that you don't get a lot of co-sponsors on the legislation, and just make it clear that, because people that believe in that actually care about energy, freedom, conservatives, libertarians, whoever you are, liberals who actually, plenty of liberals out there who do believe in freedom and want actual affordable energy, need to reach out and find their concerns.
This doesn't need to be a Republican or Democrat. It needs to
No,
be
it
an
doesn't.
American issue. Because
blackouts don't discriminate.
Yeah. Believe me, I've been through two. I went through one in 2020 and just went through one a couple of weeks ago where we had some severe storms here in Texas, and they're not fun. I think the first time we were without electricity for 5 days when it was 0 degrees, and then the second time we were without electricity for 4 days. And you really don't appreciate it until you don't have electricity, and then now you're talking about the government creating those problems. I mean, as far as with all these crazy laws and stuff, and I personally believe it's all about money, right? There's somebody making a lot of money off of it.
Yeah, unfortunately, I fear that it might take some serious problem, like a serious blackout or multiple blackouts in different areas of the country, something major to kind of wake people up to the threats to the grid. Unfortunately, it might take that. I hope it doesn't, but I think that's maybe where we're headed, but I hope not. So,
well, Daren, it was great to have you on the show today. How do our listeners follow you?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here, and you can follow me by going to Competitive Enterprise Institute's website, which is CEI. That's Competitive Enterprise Institute, CEI.org.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on again, and I'd love to have you back again in the future.
All right. Thank you so much.
This podcast is a presentation of Rich Dad Media Network.